Is the podium merely a stage or a battlefield? Imagine the eyes of the entire world fixated on Ibrahim Traoré, standing tall and resolute as he steps before the UN General Assembly. The moment crackles with electricity. Every breath he takes, every syllable he utters carries the weight to shake entire regimes. What he says next, unfiltered, unapologetic, will ripple through boardrooms, newsrooms, and war rooms alike. This is not just a speech. It's a summons to choose sides. He opens with no pleasantries, no scripted flattery for the gathered dignitaries. His voice is calm, yet there's an unmistakable edge that slices through the stiff air of diplomacy. We stand at a crossroads of impunity and accountability. The words echo, bouncing off marble walls and centuries of empty promises. Delegates shift in their seats. Some avert their gaze. Others lean in, hungry for what comes next. He paints the picture with painful precision. Decades of occupation, dispossession, and despair. He doesn't hide behind statistics. He wields them like a scalpel. He talks of families evicted overnight, their homes turned to dust and memories. He talks of olive groves burned, of mothers forced to bury their children under the gaze of foreign soldiers. The images are not abstract. They're vivid, raw, and undeniable. This is not about one people versus another. It's about a machinery that feeds off human misery, generation after generation. He does not name Netanyahu outright at first, but every phrase cuts closer to the bone. He describes leaders who preach democracy but practice domination, who speak of security but deliver siege. His tone sharpens as he shares stories that never make the headlines, of checkpoint bursts and midnight raids, of children who've never known a sky without drones. Each word lands like a stone thrown into stagnant waters, breaking the calm with ripples of truth. Then comes the pivot. Traoré's eyes sweep across the hall, catching ambassadors who represent powers that have funded, armed, and defended this cycle. This is not just one man's policy, he says. It is a collective failure, a web of interests and silence. He doesn't spare the complicit. He invokes the Geneva Conventions, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UN resolutions that gather dust while human lives are crushed under tanks and blockades. He shifts from accusation to warning, his voice steady yet thunderous. When law is treated as an option, when human dignity is negotiable, the entire fabric of our civilization begins to tear. He tells them that if they turn their heads now, they pave the way for greater horrors, atrocities that won't be confined to one region. He speaks of a world that becomes numb to suffering, where might replaces right, and where one leader's impunity becomes another dictator's blueprint. And then, like a masterful conductor, he quiets the room. His eyes lock onto the cameras, onto Netanyahu, watching from a distant screen. This must end, he says, not as a plea but as a declaration. His words hang in the air, heavy with the promise of consequences. He speaks of sanctions that will not be symbolic, but real, targeted, legal, and unrelenting. He speaks of international courts that will not be bought, of communities mobilizing across continents. The message is clear. The age of unchecked power is dying, and those who cling to it will be dragged into the light. By the time Traoré finishes, the room is so still you can almost hear the pulse of a global audience glued to screens. Diplomats exchange nervous glances. Journalists scribble headlines they know will ignite fury and hope in equal measure. What began as a speech has transformed into something more potent. A gauntlet flung at Netanyahu's feet, a line drawn in the sand for every nation watching. As he steps away from the podium, Ibrahim Traoré leaves behind a chamber stripped of its usual polite illusions. His brutal warning rings in every ear. Choose complicity or choose justice. The world watches. Will they dare pick it up? Picture the moment Netanyahu rises. The air is so thick with tension, it's as if the entire hall holds its breath. Cameras zoom in, every lens ready to capture his reaction to Ibrahim Traoré's stinging indictment. Some expect fiery denial. Others a carefully rehearsed deflection. But what comes next takes the room by surprise. A calculated pivot cloaked in the language of security and victimhood. Netanyahu, face composed yet eyes betraying a flicker of unease, leans into the same old narrative. National defense, existential threats, the right to self-preservation. He weaves tales of rockets, tunnels, militants hiding behind innocent civilians. He paints himself as a reluctant warrior, forced to protect his people against unyielding enemies. But as his voice echoes off the marble walls, Traoré stands unmoved, the weight of truth anchoring him. Before Netanyahu can cement this pivot, Traoré tears into the heart of the defense, its economic engine. He lays out the cold, methodical breakdown, how resource control strangles communities into dependence. He shows the maps, water aquifers redirected, farmland confiscated, border trade choked by checkpoints that appear and vanish at the whim of a command. He cites numbers that cannot be spun away. Entire villages surviving on a fraction of the water per capita that settlers enjoy just miles away. He talked about unemployment rates so high they birthed desperation, about demolished homes that clear land for new settlers but erase centuries of memories for those pushed aside. It's not abstract. He tells a story of one father whose orchard was bulldozed overnight, of a mother forced to bribe a soldier just to cross a barrier to reach a hospital. These details pierce through Netanyahu's broad strokes defense. Facts become faces. Statistics become stories. It's surgical yet deeply human, an indictment impossible to dismiss. Then Traoré tackles the word that has justified it all: security. He does not trivialize it. He acknowledges the right of any nation to protect its citizens. But he asks a question that no one wants to answer honestly. When does security become oppression? When does it turn into the slow suffocation of a people's future? He reminds the room that the rockets don't come from nowhere. They grow from hopelessness, from generations trapped in cages with no door to dignity. He doesn't excuse violence. He dissects its roots, exposing the cycle that perpetual occupation guarantees. But Traoré does not come just to condemn. He comes armed with an alternative. He outlines what could be: genuine ceasefires brokered in good faith, not riddled with loopholes; reconstruction funded without strings that re-entrench control; real steps toward a two-state reality, not a mirage to buy time while settlements expand. He describes third-party monitors to ensure compliance, peacekeepers who serve no flag but peace itself, corridors for aid and trade that sustain life, not feed blockades. His words grow warmer as he paints what peace could look like. Children from both sides sharing schools, markets bustling with a mix of languages, families free to worship, to work, to dream without dread. For a heartbeat, the room sees it too, a flicker of a future that seems impossible, yet tantalizingly close if courage wins over calculation. But he does not let the halls sink into a daydream. He sharpens his tone again, snapping every diplomat back to the reality they must not ignore. This vision, he says, voice ringing like a bell, can never grow in soil watered by injustice. Accountability must come first. Those who have profited from perpetual conflict must answer for the misery they've sown. The global community must stand up, not stand by. As he finishes, the tension in the room has transformed. It's no longer the tension of an argument. It's the tension of a choice waiting to be made. For a brief moment, Traoré's voice carries a note of hope, but behind it lies the steely certainty that if the world fails to choose coexistence, then the spiral of destruction will continue. And this time, no one will be able to claim they didn't know. Silence blankets the chamber, like a storm cloud refusing to break. Traoré's words hang there, alive in every corner, as the delegates squirm in the uncomfortable light of his challenge. Netanyahu's rebuttal sits on the table, but it feels flimsy now, frayed at the edges by the truths that Traoré has laid bare. Cameras swing across rows of delegates. Some whisper behind folded placards. Others stare into the distance, wrestling with a question they can't dodge. How long can they hide behind neutrality when neutrality feeds injustice? Traoré doesn't give them the luxury of retreat. He shifts his aim from one man's policies to the entire world's complicity. He asks them, each representative draped in their nation's colors, what their flags truly stand for. Are they banners of freedom and dignity, or silent witnesses to cruelty they've learned to call complex geopolitics? He speaks now not of Gaza alone, but of history's repeating patterns. Rwanda, where a million were butchered while the world held press conferences and drafted statements of concern. Bosnia, where neighbors who once shared coffee were turned against each other, while bureaucrats debated definitions of genocide. Cambodia, where entire generations vanished while global powers bickered over spheres of influence. Every example stabs at the conscience of those seated before him. A mirror reflecting how moral failure, once tolerated, mutates and spreads. His voice is neither loud nor theatrical. It's deliberate, like a judge reading a verdict that cannot be appealed. He reminds them that justice delayed does not stay frozen in the past. It breeds monsters for future. If international law becomes optional for powerful, then every tyrant waiting in the wings will see that impunity is possible, so long as they have the right allies, the right excuses, the right propaganda. Traoré looks up, letting his words travel beyond the gilded chamber and into every home watching this moment unfold. He speaks now to the people, bypassing the leaders who shuffle papers and check their phones to avoid his stare. He calls on citizens, students, activists, those who will inherit the ruins if this cycle doesn't break. History, he says, is not written by speeches alone, but by the actions that follow them. The camera catches a young delegate from a small island nation, eyes wet, whispering to a colleague he's right. Yet Traoré knows words without a plan are just wind. He brings his argument back to the ground with precision. He outlines a path the world could take, one that demands courage. He calls for an independent commission with teeth, not tied hands. He wants open access for humanitarian groups to enter the places politicians prefer to keep in shadow. He proposes trade embargoes that target the machinery of occupation without strangling everyday people. He demands a freezing of funds that fuels settlement expansions, the rerouting of aid to rebuild schools, hospitals, homes. Some ambassadors shift uncomfortably. They know these measures bite. Traoré doesn't flinch. He says plainly, if accountability feels like an attack, then you've aligned yourself with injustice. Stand with peace, and accountability becomes your shield. The message is piercing. It's not vengeance he seeks. It's a moral reset, a chance to choose the side of children over the side of bombs. He closes a chapter not with anger, but with an unexpected grace. He speaks of his own country's scars, how the people of Burkina Faso know the sting of being overlooked, how solidarity is not just a word, but a force that once turned back the darkness. He holds up this truth as a promise, that even the smallest nation, the quietest voice, can spark a reckoning when it dares to say what others fear. As his final words echo off the stone walls, a hush falls that is deeper than before. This is not the silence of dismissal. It is the silence of people who know they've been called out, stripped of excuses, left with only a choice that history will remember. Somewhere in that hush, a new possibility breathes, fragile but alive. Silence stretches across the UN hall, like a wound that no one wants to touch. The world watches through flickering screens. Millions of eyes, millions of minds grappling with the tremor that Ibrahim Traoré's words have set in motion. Some delegates scribble frantic notes. Others lean back, weighed down by the undeniable truth. The old excuses no longer hold. But Traoré isn't finished. He knows this moment demands more than a speech. He shifts forward, his voice now calm, almost gentle, the calm of someone who knows the storm is already here. He opens a folder, thin but heavy with revelations that pierce diplomatic shields like arrows. He begins to read testimonies. Families forced from ancestral homes overnight. Farmers watching their wells poisoned, their crops flattened by bulldozers. Teachers standing in schools that become rubble before the day's first lesson can end. He doesn't flinch. He doesn't soften it for the cameras. The world must see what it has ignored. Then he drops what no one expected. Declassified satellite images, signed directives, financial trails that lead straight to the architects of the settlements, the back channels that funnel aid meant for rebuilding into expansion projects that bulldoze hope instead. It's not a rumor now. It's proof. And in that proof is a warning far sharper than any threat. He fixes his gaze on the rows of powerful states whose money and silence make this cycle possible. This, he says, voice steady as stone, is not just Netanyahu's legacy. This is yours too if you do nothing. His words slice the air. In boardrooms across the world, advisors lean toward their screens, realizing that this is no longer a local issue that can be swept under press releases and political spin. It's global now, raw, exposed, undeniable. But in the same breath, Traoré offers a bridge. He calls for an independent international tribunal. Not a symbolic hearing, but a real reckoning with subpoena power, funding to protect witnesses, and transparency so the world can see every step. He demands an immediate freeze on settlement expansions, monitored by neutral observers. He proposes a reparations fund, seeded by the very nations that have propped up the occupation for decades. It's a roadmap for accountability, not vengeance, but justice that plants seeds of real peace. Then, with a voice that trembles just slightly, a crack that makes him more human, more real, Traoré shares a vision that stands in stark contrast to the horrors he's laid bare. He asks the hall to imagine a child in Gaza waking up not to sirens, but to sunlight spilling through an intact roof. He asks him to see an Israeli child who never learns the sound of an air raid shelter. He paints a future of two people standing side by side in markets, in classrooms, in playgrounds that echo with laughter instead of drones. For a heartbeat, he lets that vision linger, a fragile possibility that feels more powerful than any weapon. He leans in for his final words, lowering his voice, so the world has to lean in too. History will not ask if you were comfortable when you heard these truths. It will ask what you did next. Did you stand up or did you stand by? He pauses, one heartbeat too, eyes locked on the cameras that will carry his words to every corner of the earth. As he steps back from the podium, the room is so quiet it feels like the whole world is holding its breath. There is no applause at first, only the thunderous silence of people realizing they just witnessed a line drawn in the sand that cannot be ignored. Outside, news outlets scramble to push the story live. Inside, some leaders sit frozen, knowing this moment will chase them into every summit, every interview, every vote they cast. Ibrahim Traoré turns, walks away from the podium, his footsteps echoing across marble and memory alike. He came not just to speak, but to deliver a brutal warning wrapped in a fragile promise. The future will judge whether the world finally chose courage over complicity. And somewhere, far beyond the cold lights of the UN chamber, millions watch and wonder what they will choose too.